is known as the Patristic period. Therefore, the study of patristics refers to the study of the history and theology of the early Christian Church. We will begin our study with the post-apostolic age, which, as the name suggests, begins where the apostolic age ends, with the leadership of those whom the apostles had chosen to succeed them. In fact, we can already see the second generation of church leaders in the pages of the New Testament, in people like Mark, Luke, and Timothy, to name just a few. Therefore, the post-apostolic age has something of an overlap with the New Testament, and in fact, there is no well-defined line of division between the age of the apostles and the next phase of church history. At the very least, we have to acknowledge that some apostles lived longer than others. Thus, the second generation of leadership begins earlier in some places than in others. Therefore, our exploration begins in the late 1st century. And though we will not focus on any of the documents that would come to be included in the New Testament, a few of the documents we will examine were written before the latest of the New Testament writings. One must keep in mind that the New Testament as we know it was not yet a standardized collection even in the 2nd century. And while the formation of the New Testament canon is a subject for another chapter, we will begin to ask the question why some of the earliest Christian writings were not included in the Christian Bible. The post-apostolic age encompasses two phases of the history of the Church. The first phase is often referred to as the age of the Apostolic Fathers. The second is the age of the apologists. Each will be explained as we come to it. However, for now, it is important to note that just as there is overlap between the apostolic, New Testament age and the post-apostolic age, there is also an overlap and no clear dividing line between the time of the Apostolic Fathers and the apologists within the post-apostolic age. Therefore, we will not concern ourselves with attempting to define these stages of church history by a strict time frame. In general, the post-apostolic age runs from the last decades of the 1st century to the last decades of the 2nd century, or about AD 80 to AD 180. This latter date is a turning point because the first true theologians emerge at the end of the 2nd century, beginning a new era in the history of the Church. After that, the age of the early theologians takes us up to the early 4th century, leading to the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. This time is a watershed in Christian history for reasons that will become evident. The origin of Christianity in context. When one reads the New Testament, it is relatively easy to see that from the very beginning, the movement Jesus started was in conflict with the leaders of his own religion of Judaism. At first, that conflict was an internal struggle between two competing ways of understanding God's revelation. Both sides were forced to face their irreconcilable differences when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. After that point, the sacrifices ended and the priesthood eventually died out, and Judaism itself had to figure out how to continue as a religion without the sacrificial system that was once central to its faith. The vast majority of Jewish faithful followed the Pharisees, the experts in the Jewish law who became the rabbis. They made the written word of God, the Torah, the new center of their faith. However, a minority of Jewish believers went a different way. They followed the disciples of a man called Jesus of Nazareth, and these disciples taught that Jesus was himself the living Word of God. Those who took this path, of course, would eventually be called Christians. But we have to keep in mind that the concept of Christianity as a separate religion did not exist in the beginning. In the 1st century, the movement Jesus started was known simply as the Way. Acts chapter 9, verse 2. See also John chapter 14, verse 6. And it was only after the destruction of the Jewish temple